Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, in a week where there were several interesting bits of Brexit news coming out, I'd like to take a look at, first of all, the government's first public statement preparing the groundwork for the acceptance of a youth mobility scheme with the EU. Oh, but did they rule it out? No, I said months ago they never ruled it out. I also like to springboard from that onto another very interesting piece of news and urge Rejoin campaigners stop wasting time on dead ends, pursue something which could unlock major progress if it's managed well. But first, for daily political commentary, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out. So earlier this week, Nick Thomas-Symonds, the European Affairs Minister, now, I mean, he's got a few little job titles, but most of them don't have any work attached to them. So you could basically think of him as like the Brexit Minister, was being asked questions by a committee about the government's negotiation strategy with the EU. Now, at one point, he was asked about the youth mobility deal, which the EU is known to be prioritising, and on whether the UK would accept EU proposals. He sort of said, well, it depends what you mean by youth mobility, but we're looking at the proposals. And although this still sounds very cagey language, because Labour are petrified of any suggestions of freedom of movement, more on that later, people are seeing this as the first public comment from a minister that we are considering the move. At the announcement, EU policy expert David Hennig made the point that he said back in summer, when Labour was sounding resistant to the idea, that it was just a crass negotiation strategy. He told his contacts in the EU, ignore it, it's just posturing, forget about it. And lo and behold, half a year later, the Labour government are publicly saying that they're open to the idea, having gained nothing. Essentially, the point being made is that the government messed up in being so coy about the youth mobility deal, that they tried to, as I described at the time, use it as a bargaining chip for movement on what we're after, but that we'd have been better off enthusiastically agreeing to the proposal, which is in our interests anyway, and use that to show that we mean business about closer ties when some in the EU are not at all convinced. Basically, Labour have wasted all that time pretending to be resistant to the proposal, and now it's failed. They should update their understanding of the situation, be a bit more positive about what are obviously mutually beneficial arrangements, and move on to the genuine areas of negotiation as soon as possible. Hennig is saying that this ploy of Labour's has basically backfired, and what was always going to be a slow process may now be even slower. But at the risk of pissing people off, I'm going to extend this as well. I've said it a few times. Lots of people commenting on the issue on pro-EU platforms have also wasted their time as well. All of this talk about Labour ruling out the youth mobility scheme was absolutely nonsense. Every single time I pointed out how it was nonsense, no matter how many times I pointed out that the headlines would describe Labour as ruling it out, but the article, the quotes in the article never did, but people kept on at it. I mean, listen to this quote, specifically on the subject of the youth mobility scheme. No one will say it publicly at this stage, but there is acknowledgement that this is an area where we will need to move. If we are serious about resetting relations with the EU, then we need to be prepared to give them some of the things they want. That is a government quote, a Labour government quote from August. If it wasn't obvious before, and it was, then it should have been from this point that Labour were just playing silly buggers and were going to agree to the scheme at some point. And absolutely everyone, and I mean everyone, who was banging on about Labour ruling the scheme out from that point in late August has been wasting everyone's time, because we should have been focusing energy on pushing areas where the government really are going in the wrong direction. And another of those areas received a little jolt this week as well. New research suggests that a lot of people would accept freedom of movement in the UK. Shockingly, I actually was surprised about this. Way more Leave voters now support freedom of movement in return for access to the European market. It's not that they're necessarily in favour of it, but as a price to pay for better access to the European market than oppose it. It's supposed in the reports on the polling that a lot of people have seen that immigration has actually massively accelerated since Brexit. So if they were told that Brexit was a way of dealing with immigration, they've now decided that that's not the case at all. Now, before I go over some of the results and what it might mean politically, I'm going to point out important caveats. Not all polls are good. Some of them are utterly incompetent. I've seen some being bandied about by the mainstream media which have made such obvious rookie errors that I would have been disappointed with a 15-year-old GCSE student for making them, let alone someone being given a platform in the national news. Do not take poll results at face value, especially as Labour set red lines on freedom of movement. Like the red lines on EU membership, single market, customs union, made a certain sort of political sense. Labour couldn't realistically manage those in the first parliament anyway, so not ruling them out meant losing some key voters for absolutely zero gain. But why rule out freedom of movement? It's not a philosophical policy. Keir Starmer is basically the biggest Remainer in the country, who was happy to champion freedom of movement even in 2020. And his party and voters are overwhelmingly in favour as well. So it can only be that their own internal polling said that key target voters were put off by the issue. However, the poll was carried out partially with YouGov, who have very good methodology. And I will say especially for Brexit-related polling, because they're pretty much the only pollster as far as I can tell, who even tries to take account of the dangers of false recall. So I'm happy enough that this latest poll is probably credible. At the very least, it will not be miles out. It showed very clear majorities of voters for almost all major parties being in favour of freedom of movement. The only exception, not even the Conservatives, predictably Reform UK. But even there, it's 44% in favour to 45% against. Now, I'm going to point out here, it does say here this is not necessarily voters from the 2024 election, but people by voting intention. So some of the people identifying now as Reform UK may not have been in the election. But still, that's interesting. 44% of Reform UK, of those who say they would vote for Reform UK, 44% in favour of freedom of movement, in return for better access to the European market. I mean, that's even closer than the Brexit referendum result. Also look at 60% of Conservative voters in favour to 30% against. So twice as many people who, even at this point, as recently as November, say that they would vote Conservative. Twice as many of them are in favour of freedom of movement in return for, single market access than against. So what to do with this information? Labour have committed to no freedom of movement in the manifesto. So any campaign designed them to get them to break that promise is doomed to failure. They don't want to go into the next election having broken manifesto promises. Let us not waste more time barking up empty trees like a demented dog. The aim needs to be to have different language in the next manifesto. After all, there's no credible way of taking advantage of freedom of movement in this parliament anyway. A deal to join either the EU or even just the single market would take 10 to 15 years. And even that assumes the Tories can be brought on board in some way. But, if someone pointed out to them that actually a hell of a lot of their voters are in favour as well. Of course, we know that the Tories are focused on the other ones. They're focused on the 30%, aren't they? And the way to persuade Labour to change that language for the next election is to understand why their language as it is right now. Because you look at this polling and you say, well, the attitudes can't have shifted that much in like 6 months, can they? You see that there are only small proportions of certain voting groups who are opposed to freedom of movement. Now, there's a couple of things that occur to me here. The first is, remember, Labour set their Brexit red lines a couple of years ago. So although it's not credible to suggest attitudes have shifted quite this far in like 6 months since the election, they may have shifted a long time over the last 2 years, which is when Labour was sort of setting out these red lines. Was it because of this news on record immigration last year? Has that fundamentally shifted things? That would be interesting to find out. Not just what people's attitudes are now, but why those attitudes, because that's what I want to know from both political parties and voters. Why? So that's my first thing. But we also have to understand. So if you look at a figure that says, oh, but only like 25% of these people, like in the Red Wall, are opposed to freedom of movement. So that's like in a small minority. But it's a bit, Labour will be going, yeah, but we need those voters as well. Because if you took even 10% of our vote across lots of seats around the country, we'd have actually lost them. We wouldn't be in government. So what this poll doesn't show is how many of Labour's key target voters support freedom of movement and how many oppose it. It does try to. It has a bit of a fudge, but it is just a fudge. It's not able to accurately identify them, as made clear in the blurb. They're not claiming to. So what we really need is to be asking Labour MPs, and especially ministers where possible, to tell us what they think about freedom of movement. Not that they've ruled it out, which in this case they genuinely have, but why? Why is the most important question to be asking right now? Because nobody's actually asked that question. It's not enough to ask it once either. Politicians never answer a tricky question if you only ask it once. We need to keep asking why Labour are ruling out freedom of movement. Because there's too many people just accept it. There's too many people just go, oh, it's because they're all arseholes. It's like, why? Ask them why. Because I'm going to finish off by pointing out what Starmer said sort of on the issue at PMQs this week. Quote, I remind the leader of the opposition that the number of migrants coming to this country under her government's watch, nearly 1 million, was over 4 times the number who did so when we were in the EU. Keir Starmer has never once defended any aspect of Brexit. The Make Brexit Work slogan's cover. Smoke and mirrors. To avoid people asking him certain questions. Oh, make Brexit work. Oh, he thinks Brexit can actually be workable. No. When the subject comes up and he has to broach it, you will find not one single statement from him defending Brexit. Defending people who voted Brexit, absolutely, but not Brexit in any form. So why aren't people using their time to ask questions? Not about what the government's policy is. We know what it is. But why their policy is as it is. Ask them why we are ruling out freedom of movement, especially now that we have evidence that it has overwhelming support. Ask them why we wouldn't want to be in the single market when the Chancellor has said that our economic growth is tied to moves to get us closer to the EU. Instead of whining about imagined policies which have never existed, ask questions about the policies which do exist. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, you can join for memberships. Thanks for watching. And until next time, I'll see you later.